Well, hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to Life Beats Radio. I am your host, Dawn Mack, and gosh, it is so good to be back. We have been off air for a little while now in order to move our studios and move to a new home, and it has been quite the task, I must tell you. But we are very, very glad to be back, and what a great show we have lined up tonight. We hope that in our absence that everyone has been doing well. We have so many loyal listeners to our program, and so we're very glad to have you back with us tonight. And if you're brand new to our show, welcome aboard. We're glad to have you as well. Tonight we have an amazing guest, and I'm very, very excited because for some time, ever since I, came across her book, I've been very, interested in her topic of her book because it's something that we all have dealt with. It's something that we've all, at some point in time, been faced with, and sometimes the logistics of this can be a little bit miry, and she's just kind of so wonderfully been able to kind of put it all together. To give you a little background on our guest, she has worked in the field of learning and development for more than 25 years. She's a certified executive coach. She has trained in corporate settings across the nation and around the world in areas of leadership, communication, conflict resolution, and relationship building. And her first book is called Related by Chance, Family by Choice, Transforming Mother-in-Law and Daughter-in-Law Relationships on Kriegel Publications. And without further ado, I want to welcome to our show tonight, Deb DeArmond. Hello, how are you?
Hey, Dawn. Good to talk with you tonight. I'm glad to be with you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your schedule to speak with us. It's such an honor and a pleasure. And as I was saying in the intro, I mean, your book kind of really touches on a topic that I think for anyone who's ever been in a mother-in-law, a daughter-in-law kind of relationship, which is a very unusual, interesting dynamic in itself. But it seems like you've just kind of hit the nail on the head in so many different ways. And I guess I want to start by asking you, what inspired you to write a book on women-in-law relationships?
Well, Dawn, there's an old saying that says, a son is a son till he takes a wife, and a daughter's a daughter all of her life. Well, I had 3 boys. That was not going to work for me. And I could see the handwriting on the wall very early. I mean, I had to look at my own relationship. My parents and my husband's parents lived in the same community when we married. But I'll tell you that we spent a lot more time with my family. And it wasn't a design. It wasn't a plot. I think that women tend to be closer, daughters and mothers, than sons and their families. Mm-hmm. I just think there's a natural connection. And a young woman who's trying to learn how to be a wife suddenly finds maybe a ready ear and a mentor in her mother. And so I began to sort of question that approach as my children were coming along, and thought, we really need to pray that our family expands and grows as our sons marry and doesn't contract. And when we began praying over those little boys, when they were really quite little boys, not only did we pray for them, but we prayed for the women who would someday be their wives, who would raise our grandchildren along with our sons and be part of our family. And I think that awareness early on was one of the things that was very, very helpful. But I will also tell you that I knew that our experience as a family was not the norm. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about a woman at a retreat that I didn't know, Dawn. She leaned across the table at dinner one night and said to me kind of under her breath, I want to know your secret. And I looked up rather startled. Dawn, I wasn't even sure she was talking to me. And I looked around and was clear she was facing me, and I said, I'm sorry, were you speaking to me? She said, yeah, I want to know your secret. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know you, and I'm not sure I'd tell you a secret if I had one. But,
yeah, really.
But I just said to her, I'm sorry, I'm lost. And she smiled, and she said, well, 2 of your daughters-in-law are sharing a bunkhouse that I'm in, along with myself and my friend, and they don't like you. She said, they're crazy about you, and I want to know how you did that.
Oh, wow.
And I was startled by her question. But as we sat together after dinner and talked, I realized that there were some very specific things that the girls and I had done, and unfortunately this woman had made some of the classic mother-in-law mistakes.
Oh,
she
wow.
was looking to dig out, and she had a lot of digging to do, Dawn.
Mm. And you know, you raise a good point just a moment ago. I think I've heard it so many times. I've done it myself, but you know, I have one son. I have 3 children, but I have one son, and there is nothing like that mother-son bond, just as the father-daughter connection. And praying for our children when they are young, that God will put the right mate in their life, I think is as important, if not more important, than our children praying for that perfect mate that God wants in their life. And I think that really does kind of plant a seed, and it sets the stage for what kind of dynamic you're going to have. Because if you're in that mindset to start with, I think it does kind of lay a foundation of sorts. But you know, so many women in our position who have sons, you know, we have a defensive approach. I mean, you know, I think there's a mindset initially where we're kind of a little prejudiced. You know, we want the very best for our children, and any young woman that comes into our sons' lives, naturally we want them to be the very best. And there are, unfortunately, some, I guess, approaches or attitudes that, you know, there are some mothers that think there's no one that's ever going to be good enough for my son, you know. And that's really disheartening, because you think about that's kind of really setting a precursor for the relationship that could be as time goes on and it evolves.
I couldn't agree with you more, Dawn. And I'll tell you that this woman that I spoke to fell into all of those patterns you just talked about. This was her only son. He was the baby in the family. He was very close to his mom, or had been. And then when he went away to college, grew up, he actually entered the military. There's a little bit of distance, but she told me every sin that this young woman had: lousy housekeeper, lazy mother, terrible cook. You know, I mean, she just made the list. And then when she was done, Dawn, she looked at me and she said, "But I'm not telling you anything I haven't already told her." And I was floored. And she said to me, she's never going to be good enough to marry. She wasn't good enough to marry my son, and she's still not good enough to be his wife. And she would have never been my choice for him. And I remember looking at her and I said, but she was his choice. And the best way to support your son is to honor that choice and do what you can to be supportive of this relationship. And she looked at me because she was certain that this was not her fault. And I'm not saying it was all her fault. This young woman, in many respects, sounded difficult. She also wasn't a believer, and the mother-in-law was. And she said, "Well, I'll apologize to her when," and then fill in the blank. And I just said to her, "You know, it really doesn't work that way."
That's right.
And she was flabbergasted. She didn't think she had done anything wrong.
And oftentimes I don't think, you know, a lot of women, a lot of mothers feel that way, you know, because our children are as precious to us as anything can be. And of course, as I said, it kind of goes back to, we want the absolute best. But if we're a believer and our son's choice for a mate, a future wife, is not, we may be their best hope for them becoming a believer. And so everything this woman described to you, she was not helping that situation in any way, shape, or form.
I said to her, "Do you think," and that was, of course, the sin at the top of the list. It was that she doesn't know Christ. And I said, "And help me understand what you've done to reach out to her to help change her status with him." And I said, "Has there been anything between the two of you that would draw her to you?" I don't think there is. And, you know, the truth is, John, as I was raising my boys when they were, you know, elementary school age, 6, 7, 9, 10, I remember looking at them thinking, there will never be a woman good enough for these young boys. By the time they were teenagers, I began to worry I'd never find someone to take them off my hands, because that's a very difficult and different age. I started started taking applications myself. But the real issue is that as believers, we have an important role. You know, we did a lot of research for this book, and what we discovered, sadly, confirmed what we suspected, and that was that whether you're a believer or not a believer, there's not much difference in the quality of the relationship between these two women at the center of this controversy. We did online surveys, we did focus groups, we did interviews, and our online survey 93% of the women who responded identified that they had a faith affiliation, and of that group, 96% said they were Christians. 79% of that group said that they believed that their faith was foundational in their lives, that they used their principles of faith to guide their daily actions and how they made decisions. 87%, this was a startling number, I will say, were the same faith as their woman-in-law. But here's the real interesting kicker. Only 38% believed that the other woman's faith was as strong as her own. They said it wasn't foundational or reflected in the way she lived her life. So in other words, we're both Christians, but I'm far more spiritual than she is.
Oh, wow.
30%, almost a third, characterized the relationship as bad. But here was a couple of telling statistics, Don. First, more than half, 57%, said the difficulties in the relationship were either mostly their fault or they at least equally shared the responsibility for the failure of the relationship. And 70% said, if I knew how to fix it, if I knew what to do, I'd be willing to make the effort. And that's really how this book got started, because once we looked at these numbers, the question I had was, how on earth, as women of faith, can that offer us no advantage in this relationship? But it doesn't, because these numbers are very similar to what we found in an online survey run by a secular women's site about 18 months before ours. They're virtually identical.
Wow.
That's sad.
It is very
really
sad.
And I will say that, when we use the terms love one another, I don't know about in your Bible, but in mine, there's no asterisk next to that verse with a note at the bottom that says, except for your mother-in-law or daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
We're not off the hook.
Mm-hmm. And really, at the heart of this issue, the contention that resides between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law it's a heart issue, and because it could be a pride issue, it could be an arrogance issue. I mean, as in the case of the subject you were speaking about, and those issues she was dealing with, obviously right out of the gate, she had her mind made up that this person was not the perfect choice for her son. And then I think a whole other dynamic that kind of comes into this is when you have mothers that are overbearing and they're nurturing throughout their son's life, or in this case he was the only one, he was the baby, and there tends to be kind of into adulthood, the mother has a really hard time of letting go.
Sure.
And then you kind of roll into this whole meddling, being in the middle of the mix of the adult life of your son and his wife. And it really does wreak havoc on a relationship, because at some point we have to realize our children are grown adults and we have to treat them as such, and we have to let them live their lives and make their mistakes, and even their choices. If we don't agree with them, we still have to, like you say, honor the fact that they've made that choice, and no matter what the outcome is, support them in it, because otherwise how are they going to learn and grow if we're constantly still trying to have our hands on them as grown adults?
Well, I agree with that completely, Dawn. It's interesting to me that it's in that first book of the Bible, and it's in very early chapters, that God really does set that sort of straight for the believer. When he says a man will leave his mother and father and cleave unto his wife, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a commandment.
That's right.
And it was designed as a very specific leaving behind and cleaving unto. And that doesn't mean you don't continue to honor your mother and father. It doesn't mean you dissolve the relationship. It means that the relationship that he's now entered into is a covenant relationship blessed by God, which has a very, very different set of sort of guidelines and rules. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear mothers-in-law saying, I just can't accept her, I said, well, then you're refusing to accept the word of God. No, I'm not. Mm-hmm. Yes, you are. It was not just, sort of a, let's try this out and see how it flies. And one of the things that I have shared with young men and women as they've become engaged is be very specific, starting with the wedding planning, and perhaps invite both sets of parents to dinner to thank them for helping raised the two of you to be able to come to this point in your lives where you're ready to begin a new life together. Honor them for their investment of time and spiritual development in you. Maybe even commemorate it. And ask them for their help. We really plan, Mom and Dad, to live according to the Word of God. And because you've been our supporters and our guidance and our mentors and our counselors for so many years, we now recognize that God asks us to turn to one another instead of running to you. So when we are tempted to do that, would you turn us around and send us back to one another?
Yeah.
If we can have some of those conversations before the wedding ever happens, then we've begun to set a very strong foundation. And unfortunately, I think one of the areas where in-laws on either side find sort of their entry point is that they become a young couple's bank once in a while. They'll loan them money in a pinch or to help them buy a home. And as I had one mother-in-law who said to me, look, without us, my husband and I, they wouldn't even have that house. I think that I'm entitled to at least give them my opinion on things that I think they're doing wrong. And there comes with that an entitlement. So I always tell young couples, be very careful. If you're not willing to open that door, then make sure you've barred it closed. Because I do understand that from the parent's perspective, but it's not the right thinking.
Exactly. And something that comes to mind for me is that, I think if parents willingly do that, I mean, that is one thing, but at the same time, it kind of goes back to the whole letting go process. I mean,
right.
I think a young couple that gets married and they're looking to buy their first home, yes, the easy way is if mom and dad's got plenty of money to spare, have mom and dad pay the down payment. But their true satisfaction and, just happiness of being homeowners is knowing that they did it by themselves and without any help and strengthening that relationship, because in a moment of crisis, it would be so tempting to call the parents up on either side and go, hey, instead of working through it together. And that is what strengthens marriage and keeps marriage intact when you don't have the outside involvement of the in-laws. And the in-laws are great, but I think that there's a point in time where parents, they rear their children throughout life into adulthood. But once children, ultimately, they're going to become adults, and they're going to have their own decisions to make. They're going to want to make their own decisions apart from what mom and dad thinks, or a mother-in-law and a father-in-law. And you have to respect the fact, and I think I've been guilty of it myself, because I have a daughter that's 23. My son is going to be 19 on Mother's Day, and my youngest daughter's 16. And so it's, sometimes I still find myself kind of holding on a little bit, and then I realize, no, they're adults. I have to kind of stop myself and go, my oldest two, they technically are legally and old enough to make decisions for themselves, and it stops me from making that phone call, but in my mind I sit there and play it out, but I don't actually ever go through with it. But in turn, the great thing that has happened is that now if something's going on, they will just call me. I don't have to call them. They'll text me or they'll call me, and we'll talk. And it's different because it is a completely different relationship. They're adults. I mean, they're young adults now, and they're not kids anymore. And so now it's transitioned to something completely different from what it was. So in regards to any mate that my children would have, naturally I want to extend that same sort of dynamic, because I don't want to be, number one, considered the mother-in-law, the dreaded mother-in-law kind of thing. But then I don't think a lot of moms think about any of that. They're just thinking about that protective maternal instinct is forevermore. and it always is there. And I think it tends to kick into overdrive sometimes when it shouldn't. And it's hard to kind of get that in check, and hit the power off button and go, it's okay. Take your hands off, kind of thing.
You've already discovered one of the really important secrets to great relationships with your adult children, and that is to remember that they're adults. I think that one of the things that I've enjoyed is that the older my kids get, the smarter I seem to them. And so now they call and say, hey, Mom, I'm dealing with this, or I'd like your opinion on that. And it's a very consultative role. And the truth is, I tell couples that when you marry, your parents are a guest in your life and in your home and in your marriage. And consulting them is perfectly fine. It was funny. My last son to marry, my youngest, met his sweetheart in January. They began dating in February. They were engaged in March and married in June. And it was very quick, but my heart recognized this young woman when she was first introduced to me. I knew, and I had complete confidence this was God's choice for my son, even though some of our friends and his older brothers weren't so sure. But 4 years later, Mama's intuition turns out to be so unbelievably right. But when we were all sitting, the first two girls, Dawn, I met Sarah when she was 13. She and Jordan were junior high school sweethearts. The second one I met when she was 16. I watched those girls grow up. I got to sow into their lives. That was a very different experience than with Penny. Penny was 28. She was an adult. She had graduated from college. She had lived on her own. She had traveled. Very different relationship. And I'll always remember when we were sitting at the house one evening looking over some of the wedding details, and when they left, she said to my son, "So, is your mother going to have an opinion about everything we do?" And he said, "Probably, but she won't be offended if we don't take the advice. She just needs to tell us." Now, I was chagrined when my son shared that with me, but I was grateful because I don't want to be that woman. And I said to Penny, "I am so sorry." And she was willing to have the conversation with me. And I said, you're going to have to help me learn how to be a mother-in-law of somebody who comes to me pretty much an adult and grown up with a lot of different kind of world experiences. And you always have permission to say, "Mom, that feels a little too close for comfort." Mm-hmm. And, I'm grateful that my son was cheeky enough to tell me about it. He thought it was just a hoot. But it opened the opportunity for me to have that conversation with Penny. And it's been a really good thing. I think, too, you said something earlier, and you said about this being a heart issue. In the book of Ruth, the story of Ruth and Naomi is interesting to me. 5 little chapters. And this is the place where the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship gets the full floodlight turned on it. And I don't think it's an accident that God picked 2 women who could not have been more different, because that's what I always hear from women. Well, my daughter-in-law is so different. Well, my mother-in-law and I are nothing alike. Well, neither were Ruth and Naomi, and I think that was by God's design that he highlighted the lives of these 2. And all of us are familiar with the story of all 3 of the women. Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah had all been widowed. Naomi is bitter. She's wanting to return to her homeland. And Ruth entreats her and begs her, really, when Naomi says, "Go back to your families, girls. Go back to your mothers and your parents' homes. I have no more sons for you to marry." We're very familiar with the verse where Ruth says, "I will go where you go. I'll live where you live. I'll lodge where you lodge. I will leave the gods of my people and worship only Jehovah. I'll embrace your people, your family, your culture, your way of it." We're familiar with that. But it was the next verse for me that totally set my heart in such just a wonderful place. When Ruth was done with her plea, Naomi, it said, when she saw that Ruth had her heart set on going, she said no more. And so my question when I hear about embattled women-in-law is, what have you set your heart on with regard to this woman? Have you decided that she's not your mother and you're not accepting her, and frankly, you can tolerate her at best, but you'll never treat her like family? Or if you're the mother-in-law, have you decided that this young woman is a disaster and never going to be good enough for your son? She's going to be the mother of your grandchildren and the gatekeeper to your relationship with them. Are you sure you want to make that choice? The heart will always follow our heart, Dawn. Exactly. And so what we've set our heart on, well, we're going to follow that. We're going to follow that.
That is so true, but I think that kind of gets lost in the perspective of the mother-in-law daughter-in-law relationship.
It does,
because the daughter-in-law, naturally, if there is any type of antagonistic conflict initially early on with the mother-in-law to be or mother-in-law after the fact, the daughter-in-law can feel very inadequate because the mother-in-law may have made her feel that way.
Well, and I'll tell you, it doesn't always have to be that there was actually something between the 2 women. I think we've been culturalized to believe this is not going to ever be a good relationship. Think about Marie Barone, the ever-intrusive neighbor on Everybody Loves Raymond, and think about Jane Fonda and Jennifer Lopez in Monster-in-Law. There's cartoons and jokes. I think young women come to the relationship sometimes expecting the worst, and then every little lift of the eyebrow or tilt of the head is interpreted in some critical way. And so I don't think it's always mothers-in-law who come to the relationship with the problem. I've talked with lots of heartbroken women who say, I had a woman who wrote to me after the book was published, and she read it, and she said to me, I love the young woman that my son has been dating. I was thrilled when they announced their engagement. She said 2 weeks after their engagement, they asked me to go to coffee. And when we sat down together, my daughter-in-law laid out the rules. From the time we marry, you will no longer have conversations with your son that do not include me, or interactions, dinners, meetings. If you're going to be spending time with Bud, I'm going to be there too. And this woman was absolutely stunned. And she said, is this normal? I said, no. And she said, is it fair? I said, no. And she said, so what do you think I should do about it? I said, I think you're going to have to honor their choice. And she said, well, this was her choice. And I said, your son was there? Yes. What did he say when she was laying down the law? And she was very quiet, and she said, not a word. I said, well, then he either agrees with her or he's afraid to cross her. And in either case, the best way for you to deal with this is to demonstrate to her, I'm disappointed, but I'm willing to follow whatever outline you'd like us to have in our relationship. I said, demonstrate to her she has nothing to be fearful of when it comes to your presence in her life. That was a hard message for her to hear.
Exactly.
But somewhere along the line, that young woman, either watching her friends with mothers-in-law, watching her own mother struggle with her grandmother, has suggested to her, you need to protect your territory, you need to keep her out of your life as much as is possible, and you need to make sure she never has any time with your husband by herself. That's bad.
You know, and that's just an insecurity mechanism within that young woman. And, you know, I think from a young woman's perspective that is in a serious, committed relationship and has aspirations to marry, you know, her beau, one of the most, I think, important things to that woman is, or let's back up, possibly early on in the relationship when, you know, she hasn't met his family. And the one thing that matters to her the most is, I wonder if his mother is going to like me.
Yeah.
And that's always the conversation that kind of comes up. I've done it in relationships I've had, you know, and when I've met, you know, boyfriend families, and it's, you know, that's the conversation you have immediately following you depart from the family event, and you ask that significant other, okay, what did your family think of me? Did they like me? You know, you need that affirmation, because that kind of sets the tone depending upon the feedback of what's going to happen from there. And you're just over the moon if you find out that you get glowing marks. And if you don't really get a lot of, you know, it really depends on the guy too, but if you don't really get a lot of feedback that's positive, or hardly any at all, you don't know what to make of it. So you kind of have to form your own opinions after being around them to determine, okay, do they really like me or do they not really like me? So it is interesting because, you know, I think that can set a tone, but on the flip side, like you were just talking about, you know, if you have a situation where the girlfriend has had, or the wife-to-be has had a very bad experience that at some point spoke to her and said, this is what you have to do in order to protect yourself in this relationship. And, you know, just don't let the mother-in-law get close. But you know, people have to understand that their personal situation does not mean that it's going to be like someone related to them or their best friend went through it. You know, it's all what you make it. And you know, it's just like going into a relationship with baggage. If you don't unpack that baggage and leave it at the curb, so to speak, you're going to bring it in, and it's going to be all the stuff from all the previous relationships you've been in that, you know, just don't need to be there. So it really just has to become about you and that person. And you really can't judge someone based on a previous experience that you may have been a part of or privy to by association, so to speak.
I completely agree. In fact, one of the chapters in the book is called "Leave That Baggage on the Carousel," It's just not helpful. And the poor guy, the man in the middle, we deal with him in the book as well. Sometimes he's just trying to stay off the radar, and without realizing it, he's making the situation so much worse than it already is. So it's a book that wouldn't leave me alone, Dawn, from that conversation at the retreat, and then discovering what we discovered. And when I say we, the girls were very much a contributor, all three, and my daughter-in-law, Penny, who writes, she voiced the young woman's voice. She sat down with her sisters-in-law and then a focus group, and they wrote the chapter from the young woman's perspective, the daughter-in-law's perspective. I thought it wouldn't be fair to have the mother-in-law write all of the chapters, that we needed to get that other perspective in there. And we've heard, what's been really just humbling is how many women have said, you know, I was certain when I picked up this book I was going to learn all about what my daughter-in-law or my mother-in-law is doing wrong, and what I discovered is that God was asking me to turn the mirror towards myself. And he really does expect me. And I'll tell you that a frequent interview question is, well, if the older woman is the more mature in the Lord, isn't it her role to sort of initiate some peacemaking? And I always say, I don't care which one it is. Whoever wants to make the Heavenly Father smile quickly will be the one who will say, could we try this again? It's not always been good. In fact, one of the things that we did is we've created a line of cards that help start those conversations, and I've been amazed at how popular they've become with my readers. It's hard to start digging out when you've been piling on for 5, 10, or 15 years or more, and yet God asks us so much more of us.
Yeah, He really does.
If we can't love family, we're in big trouble. And my belief is that if the enemy can divide the family, he can divide the church. And I'm not talking about the local congregation.
That's right.
And
that is so
that's
true.
Huge. Yeah.
Well, and it really just all boils down to loving one another. And you know, and family is the cornerstone, the core of who we are. And, you know, and naturally it's just only normal and natural that our children that we have are going to grow up and become adults. They're going to want lives of their own. They're going to start lives and families with a significant other, a mate, a special mate that they've chosen to spend that life with. And in essence, that is growing and expanding the family. And when your children take a mate and they get married and they start their family, that mate becomes part of the family because they are now part of your child's life, you know, your adult child's life. And, you know, and those grandchildren, that's a whole other dynamic. And that's a question I have for you. Is there going to be another book that would be a follow-up to this that would be in regard to, say, the grandchildren dynamic of the mother-in-law, the daughter-in-law, where, you know, you've got children, or is there something in the book regarding that already?
Yeah, we do deal with the extended family because when this relationship is bad, there's nobody who's safe. And one of the really heartbreaking stories that that a woman shared with me is she said, I look back and I remember my mother struggling with my dad's mom, with her mother-in-law. And she said, we saw very little of them as a result. And she said, I always missed having grandparents. But she said, do you know, I've repeated the same thing. I don't like my daughter-in-law. I don't think she's a kind person. I don't think she's an honest person at times. But she said, I just decided that I was going to cut her out of my life. And she said, I didn't realize that it was going to cost me my grandchildren. And she said, just like it cost my grandmother her grandchildren. She said, I should have been able to see the writing on the wall, but she said, I didn't see that coming. We also talk about the fact that if you'd like to have the opportunity to be part of your grandchildren's life, sometimes the marriage doesn't survive. Sometimes there's a divorce. And we had several women who shared stories where they said, look, this young woman and my son, their relationship ended. And so I guess technically we're no longer in-laws. But she still lives in my heart. She's someone I still care about, still stay in touch with. And that's true sometimes even when there aren't any children involved. And so it's an equal opportunity for either sadness or just really outrageous success in families. There is a next book, but it deals with marriage. It doesn't deal with in-laws, but I'll tell you what, you don't talk about in-laws unless you're also talking about marriage. And so
exactly.
we talked in the book about how marriages were impacted. It was interesting. I had some fathers-in-law who said, you never hear about fathers-in-law and sons-in-law picking at one another, do you? Nope. We just don't let the little thing. He said we keep the little things little, and we don't let them become the big things. And he said, but with women, it's high drama. And I have to say, it's unfortunately emotional. We're more emotional. And he said it has become a sticking point. He said when my wife starts in on my daughter-in-law, I've just told her, count me out. I'm not interested in hearing it anymore. It's one of those things that doesn't change unless we make a decision to change it, and that's why it's related by chance and family by choice. Becoming family is a choice.
That's true. And, and I'll just say this as we're wrapping up. I'm a divorced mom, and my former husband and I, we still have a great relationship. And even when we were married, his mom and I got along wonderfully well. We never had I don't ever recall us we were ever at odds. Now, he is the youngest of 3 brothers. So, coming into that situation, of course, that was like, okay, there were already 2 daughter-in-laws ahead of me who were slightly older. So they had been in the family for some time, and here I am coming along. I'm the last one in with the baby of the family. But, his mom was always so very gracious towards me. She never treated me differently. And even after we divorced, even to this day, if I see her, she hugs me, we talk. It's like we've never missed a beat. She still considers me family and I her. I still call her my mother-in-law or former mother-in-law, but, there's still that. She is still the grandmother to my children, and she always will be. And so, but I think, it has a lot to do with the people individually as who they are and where their heart is and what kind of people they are and how they treat people. That plays into all of that as well. And as well as I, that when you are in a divorce situation, oftentimes it's not optimal in a lot of cases. My ex-husband and I, we were very fortunate that we did not have all of those antagonistic dynamics that come into play when people are going through divorce. And to this day, it's proven to be very, very good for our children and us and everyone involved, which has been very good. But, but I'm thankful that I could call my former mother-in-law right now if I wanted to and just pick up the phone and say hello or, go have coffee with her. It would be fine. And, my former husband, he's remarried, and we've just been very blessed, I guess is the best way to put it.
You're absolutely right. And here's the thing. It's just not that common that it works out that way. So you all really ought to be sort of cheered on for the sort of adult approach that you took in the relationship, because it has created a level of peace. Your children were never forced to choose between their parents, and you've maintained relationship with the woman who made it possible for your children to belong to you. Because without her, I always tell young women, hey, she couldn't be all bad. She raised the man of your dreams. Come on.
Well, that is the driving point to all of this. At the end of the day, if he was raised by his mother, and that is kind of where it all starts, right? And made him into the man that, at some point, that young woman looked at and said, that's going to be the man I'll marry. So, he didn't get that way on his own.
No, and Dawn, I always when I'm asked for what's that one parting piece of advice, I always remind daughters-in-law, she raised the man of your dreams. Without him, your life would be significantly different. And I always remind mothers-in-law that when God conceived the concept of the family, he never intended for moms to be the most important woman in that young man's life. He's ours to raise, but never to keep. And that was God's plan from the beginning. And, I'm reminded that when God brought a woman to Adam in the garden, it wasn't his mother, it was his wife. Yeah. That was God's clear sort of opinion on the topic.
Exactly. And that, that was where it all began, in the Garden of Eden. That was his plan, and that is what we should honor always.
Absolutely.
Well, Deb, this has been, I could talk to you for hours about this. This is such a delightful topic. And it's, the book is just so interesting. And I'm so thankful that you took it upon yourself to write a book like this, because it, I'm sure, has answered a multitude of questions for mother-in-laws, daughter-in-laws out there who, like you say, just went about the book thinking that it was going to be, who did this, who did that, but it ends up being a lovely idea of how it should be, how a relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law should be. And I love the fact that you've done this, because it's helped so many people, I'm sure, bridge gaps and strengthen their relationships that, are core relationships to the family unit.
Absolutely.
That goes beyond the bounds of just to, the mother-in-law, the daughter-in-law. You have children, and grandchildren, and it really does promote harmony. And so thank you so much for doing that, because I think you've had a huge impact on that relationship and that dynamic.
Well, God wrote it. I got to be involved, and that was the fun part. That was the fun part for me.
He is so good indeed.
He
well,
is.
Deb, thank you so very much for being our special guest this evening. It has been such a delight speaking with you and such a special time, and we would love to have you back when you get the new book finished at some point and to talk about that one as well. And but thank you.
I'd love to. Thank you, Dawn.
Take care, and God bless, and happy Mother's Day to you.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. We've been speaking with Deb DeArmond, and she is the author of Related by Chance, Family by Choice, Transforming Mother-in-Law and Daughter-in-Law Relationships. And if you have not had a chance to read it, if you are a daughter-in-law or you are a mother-in-law, it would behoove you to do so. It is a great read, and it is very, very informational and has a ton of information of how to heal relationships, build relationships, and to make that special dynamic between a mother and a daughter-in-law so very special. And again, it's published on Kriegel Publications. But if you will, you can go to Deb's website. It's debdearmond.com, and you can get all the information of where you can purchase that. Also, you can visit her on Facebook. Go and like her page at author Deb DeArmond, or follow her on Twitter at Deb DeArmond. And her last name is spelled DeArmond. And to stay up on all that she has going on. So we want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Special thanks to Deb DeArmond for being our special guest. It was such a delightful time speaking with her, and we look forward to having her back in the near future. And it has been great being back tonight. So we are so excited to be back on air after having a brief hiatus. Thank you for bearing with us through it all. But that is going to wrap our show for this evening. So please visit lifebeatsradio.com for all of our upcoming guests and special events that we have going on. So for Life Beats Radio, I am Dawn Mack, wishing you all a wonderful evening. God bless, take care, and good night.